Good afternoon, everybody. This is a War Room to the Boardroom. Today I'm talking with Brigadier General Banks, retired. He'll be sharing his journey from flag officer and academic to being the associate dean at Kellogg and now the director for the Doerr Center, being a board member and a leadership consultant. I'm your host, as always, Mayshawn Wilson, Global Business Strategy and Ops at Google, combat veteran, Duke MBA and West Pointer. For those that don't know of General Banks and his illustrious career and many esteemed titles, he currently works as the director for Rice University's Doerr Institute for New Leaders. He's a former associate dean of leadership from Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. He's an independent director for Customers Bank and a senior advisory partner for Sentinel Partners, which is a private equity firm. He's the principal for Banks Talent Solutions, former U.S. Military Academy professor and department head for behavioral sciences and leadership, former White House aide and staff officer. He was also a Ranger qualified aviation officer and artillery officer, and command organizations from platoon up to the battalion level. He holds a BS from West Point, an MPA from the Harvard Kennedy School, an MBA from Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, an MA from Columbia University's Teacher College, and a PhD in Master's Philosophy from Columbia University. So without further delay, General Banks.
All right. Well, it's wonderful to be here, and I'm delighted that this podcast exists. When we think about the opportunity to share our experiences with others in the hopes that it might inform actions they elect to take so that they can proceed towards their objectives in a more precise way, I think that's a great way of paying it forward and giving back. So it's delighted to be here today, and I look forward to the conversation.
Definitely, sir. I remember your mentorship as a cadet, and it's continued even after our transition. So always much appreciated. So, sir, for those that don't know, who are you and how did you come to be in the military? And now you're at the Doerr Center Institute, I should say.
Who am I? Wow, that's a deep question. So I can give you some of the surface level stuff, but then I can give you some of the background that is more impactful, if you would, in terms of informing how I elect to behave on a daily basis and what I elect to do on a daily basis. I am the son of Hayes and Cassandra Banks. My father was a career military officer. My mother was a school psychologist. Because of my father's occupation, we had the opportunity to live in locations throughout the United States and abroad. Growing up, I loved living on military installations and being part of military communities. Additionally, having had the opportunity to observe my father's activities from a young age, I thought my dad had the coolest job in the world. And consequently, I decided that I want to follow in his footsteps. Now, my father was drafted into the Army during the Vietnam conflict and never intended to make the military a career when he received that initial draft notification. But as fate would have it, he discovered that he actually enjoyed the work and stayed for a full career in the United States Army. My mother, on the other hand, like all military spouses, she had to navigate that transition from one place to the other. How does she find meaningful work? How does she continue to focus on her family? And she did that all brilliantly. And so from a young age, I observed a dual income couple that figured out how to honor their professional commitments while at the same time ensure they were investing substantively in their family. And so I'm fond of saying that I was very blessed that I grew up in a home where I had two people who were dedicated to fostering my well-being. I saw what hard work looked like every day. I had certain themes reinforced from a young age. Always be truthful, always work hard, always pull energy into your school, learn how to compete, be a great teammate, and a variety of other things. And so that's my immediate family, aside from my brother, who's 1 year younger than myself, Brian. And he works as an electronics engineer for the Harris Corporation. He actually designed some of the aviation survivability equipment that exists on a range of military aircraft. And so we were separated by 1 year. I was the older brother, and we're very close, and I'm very proud of him. And so growing up in that tight-knit family, I had a wonderful support structure, and that support structure extended to my grandparents on both sides and my various aunts and uncles. Now, on my father's side, my grandparents both had 6th grade formal educations. Despite that, they put all 6 of their children through college, all 6 graduating successfully and going on to become successful professionals. And so I most certainly understand that I stand on the shoulders of those who came before me and the example they set, the support they provided, the push they routinely gave. I'm thankful for all of those things. With respect to what makes me tick, I wouldn't be where I am without family and friends. So I'm blessed to be married. I have 5 wonderful children, ranging in age from 30 down to 18, 2 boys, 3 girls. They are engaged in a variety of pursuits. My job is not to be the player, it's to be the coach at this point. And so I most certainly am trying to help them live the best version of their life as they define it, not as a construct that I define. But I am very, very fortunate to call myself their father. As a husband, I have a wonderful partner. Things that I do usually require significant expenditures of time, and I want to be able to allocate that time without a supportive partner. And I think that's an incredibly important thing to have if you're going to try to go out and do big things. And then the last thing I'd say is, having grown up all over the world, one thing that was a constant was school and sports. I played sports all the way through West Point. Still think from the mindset of an athlete, even if my body will not allow me to do the things I was once able to do. But I think it's a privilege to compete, and you have to learn how to compete well in concert with others. And so having that team orientation, having that competitive mentality, learning how to win with dignity, learning how to lose with grace, all of those things are still part and parcel to who I am today.
A lot of great elements there, sir. So understanding the support structure and kind of what is the intrinsic motivator that gets you there. Who are the people that help you get to that place? Understanding how your roles are changing from kind of active executioner to more support and mentor. And then also just a really strong family foundation to make all that happen. And so based on that experience, sir, you mentioned sports and how it's kind of carried over. Can you talk about not only how it helps you kind of guide through your military career to all of these, illustrious accomplishments, but also how you thought about the changing of the playing field going from the military and West Point out into the civilian world?
Yeah, so I'm always fond of saying that it's a privilege to compete. It's a privilege to compete. It's not a right. And if you're going to compete, what does it take to show up and be at your best? And so several things I learned through the prism of sport most certainly inform my actions, both in academia, in the military, and in the private sector. One, this notion that preparation always matters. Do you prepare as if what you are doing really, really matters? As an aviator in the military, every time you crawl into an aircraft, there's no guarantee you're going to come back safely. And so do you prepare properly so that every flight has a successful conclusion? I learned that in sport. You're only as good on game day as you are in the days leading up to game day. You can't practice poorly and then hope to play at your best on game day. And so preparation always matters. Number two, this notion that the basics are the basics for a reason. In any endeavor, there are a foundational set of activities that must transpire to standard. You can ignore those activities, but when you do so, you are lowering the probability of success. A lot of folks can get away with things for some period of time being sloppy because they have signature strengths to kind of wallpaper over, if you would, some of those deficiencies. But when things get really hard, those deficiencies always come to the fore. And so in football, it doesn't matter how good an athlete you are, if you don't run, catch, block, tackle, throw, line up properly, execute your assignment to standard, communicate effectively with those on your left and right, a less talented team will outcompete you if they are better at the basics. And I have found the same thing to be true in industry. I found the same thing to be true in the military, you name it. In the military, for example, when we talk about special operations community, what makes the special operations community special is not that they have more money or gee whiz equipment. It's that they do the basics better than anyone else. And the same thing is true outside the military. And so I learned the importance of that in sport. The basics are the basics for a reason. And then the last thing I learned from sport that translates into my activities today is this notion that to be a great teammate almost invariably requires sacrifice. That if you are constantly putting self first and not thinking about self in relation to others, you can't be a great teammate. And to be a great teammate routinely means having to examine what's in the best interest of the team, even if it means that you will have to sacrifice something, whether that's time, whether that's prominence, whatever it is. But being a great teammate, to me, one of the greatest compliments that can be paid to anyone is when someone says he or she is a great teammate. And so those are just three of the things that I took from sport, and I've kind of used them across the various contexts in which I've operated over the years.
So nailing the basics, being a really good teammate, and then really executing on your assignment to be a part of the greater, I guess, organization, greater whole. Really great wisdom, sir. In terms of where you are now, you're currently at the Doerr Center, if I'm saying that correctly, but the Doerr Institute, I should say. What exactly does that entail? What does that mean? And how does that compare not only to your last role as an accounting professor or the associate dean of leadership? Just to give us context for people that maybe have only a military background.
Absolutely. So the Doerr Institute for New Leaders is a center at Rice University, which is located in Houston, Texas. The Institute was founded approximately 8 years ago, and its charter was to enhance the leader effectiveness of every Rice student. What makes the Institute unique is that every activity we undertake is based on empirical science, and we measure it rigorously. One of the 4 reasons why leader development efforts fail to achieve their desired outcome in organizations all around the globe is a failure to actually measure results. And so at Doerr, we don't do something unless we can effectively measure it so that we can look for impact and we can use data to drive actions we elect to take or that we elect not to take. And so in this role, I have 12 full-time employees, approximately 50 contract coaches. I work across all 7 of the colleges at Doerr, or actually at Rice, and across the 11 residential colleges that also exist at the university. I report directly to the provost and the president of the university, and I work closely with our founding donors, John and Ann Doerr. John is a very famous venture capitalist for Kleiner Perkins, Caulfield and Byers out in Silicon Valley, worth approximately $11 billion. He was one of the initial investors in Google, initial investor in Amazon. He's had a lot of big wins over time. He's a very smart man. Once wrote a book called Measure What Matters. And so he's big on this notion of measurement. He's big on this notion of execution. And he had an experience once when he was visiting Rice. Both he and his wife are Rice graduates. And he was talking to some of the young people. And it became very apparent to him that despite the fact they were off the chart smart, the average SAT score at Rice is a 1505. That's the average. We have over 30,000 applicants for approximately 1,200 incoming undergraduate students annually. So these are some of the most accomplished young people academically around the globe. Yet in his dialogue with many of them, he was struck by the fact that many wouldn't look him in the eye. They didn't view self as emerging leaders. And despite the fact they worked hard, they had flawed conceptions of what does it take to be an effective leader? What does it take to really drive impact in the world? And so he said, what will it take to make Rice the absolute best institution in the world for fostering a leader identity in every one of its community members and elevating their capacity to lead well? And that's what led to the creation of the Institute. And so I oversee that endeavor. I took over this role on January 2nd, so I'm only a month into it, but I am delighted to be here. Rice is a wonderful university. Doerr is an amazing institution. And the leadership team at Rice is committed to ensuring that it continues to elevate the capabilities of every Rice community member.
Sounds like quite an ambitious goal and very much abstract and kind of hard to get after for a lot of people. And so I guess I'm curious, in terms of leadership development, how does it look different at an institution like Rice University, where your graduates will go and do a variety of things compared to leadership development that you do at, say, West Point or say a military school or even business school? How does that leadership development look different? And how does that approach change, if at all?
So when you think about the service academies, they are preparing people for a very specific context. The military academy is really geared around this notion of how do you prepare somebody to be a company grade officer, and in many respects, to be a platoon leader. Now, they'll get the hard skills associated with that when they go to their officer basic course, but all the foundational skills are meant to be acquired while they're at the academy. And you're preparing people to step into that context and to be successful. At a school like West Point or Annapolis or Air Force Academy, many of your faculty members come from that context, and they're able to share first person anecdotes regarding their perceptions of what it takes to be successful in that context. Now, you contrast that with a place like Rice. We are not preparing people for a single context, nor are we preparing them for a single role. We are preparing them to be a leader regardless of occupation. When you think about the Army, many times we think about the role you occupy: platoon leader, company commander, pilot, whatever. Leadership can be a role you occupy, but it's not necessary that it be a role. Leadership ultimately is about how you seek to influence. In fact, there's never been a definition of leading that has said must be in charge. Leadership is not an authority-based construct. It's an influence-based construct. And so one of the things we're trying to do is to activate every student at Rice's understanding that regardless of what you go do in the world, if you want to create meaningful impact in the world, there are some things we know from research and science about how you can amplify your ability to be influential. And if you do that, that's leading. How do you successfully influence so as to create outcomes that without your intervention would otherwise not come to the fore? And so we want to help our students to embrace this understanding they are a leader regardless of occupation. They are a leader regardless of location. And they are a leader who can always make a difference. It doesn't take a title to do so. And so that's a little of the difference that exists between academies where everyone's going to go off and do things that are very similar and they're going to do it in the same construct versus a university like Rice, where people are going to go off, they're going to fan out around the globe, they're going to do all kinds of things. Some are going to be in charge of other people, some are not. But regardless of what they're doing, we want them to understand that they have the ability to make a positive difference, that at the end of the day, it's all about how do you influence in a principled and effective manner, and that driving impact matters in the world. That's some of the primary differences.
So one, what is the focus and context for how you're teaching leadership, and I guess the differences across industries? And then two, in focusing it that it's not a position-based responsibility, that it's a way of influencing people towards specific outcome and goal, no matter where you sit in an organization and what industry and impact you have. I think along those lines, sir, I'm curious, one, how are you measuring that impact? And are there any metrics that would surprise our listeners, some who are in this C-suite and some who may be in academia, that can help push their thought process about how they think about leadership and leadership in different forms?
Yeah, so one of the things we know from a fabled McKinsey study that I think was published in 2014 is that there were 4 reasons why leader development efforts routinely fail to hit the mark. One was overlooking context. The fact that you might be a highly effective leader in one context does not automatically mean you'll be a highly effective leader in another. 2 was this notion that leader development many times was too generic in nature. They weren't doing real work. They might be reading case studies of other organizations, but they weren't actually being charged to work on real things inside their organization. 3 was underestimating mindsets. So dragging people to leader development activities who actually weren't open to the prospect of thinking differently about how they might approach something And then the last one is failure to measure results. So as it pertains to that, the decision was made at Doerr that we could not do anything unless we had the ability to measure it effectively. And so we use a variety of psychometric instruments in service of that. We can measure someone's perceived leader identity. We know how to do that from science. We can measure someone's perceived leadership self-efficacy being a construct whereby it's a measurement of to what extent do you believe you are capable of doing something. If you have a high self-efficacy, you're more likely to actually try to do it. We can measure some of the attributes associated with authentic leadership and a variety of other things. And so we use direct observation, we use self-report data, we use a variety of vehicles to measure movement along different behavioral scales over time. For example, what we have found at Rice is that by virtue of simply being a student at Rice, and we'll take the undergraduate population, for example, if you go through the Rice experience, there's data that suggests simply going to Rice is not going to elevate your perception of self as a leader. Like there's nothing about the experience that results in a statistically significant change in that leader identity. However, engaging in certain activities as part of your Rice experience can make a statistically significant difference, not only in leader effectiveness, but in how one views self as a leader. And so what you have are countless schools around the world and countless companies that say, we produce leaders, but they don't measure it, and they're acting based on flawed assumptions. Additionally, it sounds great in terms of marketing, but they actually have nothing to back up their assertions. And so we want to avoid all that. We said if we're going to say something, we say it because we actually have the empirical evidence to undergird whatever statements we're making. And this is why in countless companies that spend billions upon billions of dollars on leader development every year, they'll still say there's a deficit between the leaders they need and the leaders they possess. They'll have to go external many times for their most senior roles because they don't have an adequate bench so that people can move up into those roles. And the list goes on. And many times that's because while they might state leader development is one of their top 3 objectives, that statement is not backed by what they choose to prioritize on a daily basis. So it might say, hey, this is one of our top 3 things, but it doesn't fall anywhere close to the top 3 in terms of what they're actually prioritizing, resourcing, measuring. Rice is out to change the game on that.
Which is a noble commitment. I guess I'm curious, sir, what typically causes it to fall by the wayside? So if we say, hey, we are the #1 leadership development company or have the #1 leadership development program in the world, but it falls kind of further down the list in actual resource commitments and business priorities, what typically causes either that disconnect or reprioritization to happen?
This belief that if certain things are happening, it must be the result of great leadership. That's number one. Many times it can be happening because you're managing things well, but you're not actually leading things well. Managers foster stability, leaders generate change. It is possible to create a company that's ruthlessly efficient, but that efficiency is actually going to spell their demise over time because when the processes and procedures they've created no longer meet the demands of their environment, simply doubling down on those things will only speed up the path to demise. It's been said that managers seek to eliminate waste in organizations and leaders seek to inject it because leaders underwrite the experiments necessary to produce new ways of being. And so you have companies that find something that meets the demands of their time. They try to become very efficient at producing that good or service. But if they're not continually thinking about what's next, they can find their way to obsolescence very quickly because they were always thinking about today to the exclusion of tomorrow.
That's helpful. So a balance between present realities and the future growth needed to drive things forward, and then finding that right balance of both not only leader development, but also the leaders and managers needing to drive an organization forward, and a little bit of attribution kind of error to the wrong groups.
Yeah, I
if I
mean,
got that right.
you look at Clay Christensen, innovators dilemma, or talked about disruption and how we become myopically focused on the things that we're good at today, many times to the exclusion of what we need to be good at in the future. You take a look at companies that they're in dominant positions and become so dominant that they're like, what is the likelihood that we'll ever lose our position of dominance? I see a lot of movies on planes, and recently one of the movies I saw was BlackBerry. And in BlackBerry, it shows how a company gets to its heights, but then all of a sudden you had a disruption from Apple. And the founders of BlackBerry were like, that'll never work. They ignored market realities. They thought they had such a dominant position that by the time they awoke to the prospect of, oh my goodness, this Apple thing is taking off, they couldn't respond effectively. And a company that at one point was killing it got killed. One of the best examples of recognizing the importance of leadership in recent years has been the pivot of Microsoft. Microsoft under Steve Ballmer's tenure. During Ballmer's tenure, top line revenue grew by 3x, net income grew, it doubled. So over his tenure as a CEO, 3 times as much top line, 2 times as much bottom line. Yet the stock price at the end of Steve Ballmer's tenure was 40% lower than when he took over as the CEO. Now you can't say that's a market thing because during that same time frame, Apple's shares had gone from $50 to $500 a share. So what that was telling the market was we're living on legacy. We have a dominant position, right? We're ubiquitous in many organizations, but the market had no confidence that they knew what's next. And so it was only a matter of time. And so when they brought in Satya Nadella, they understood we must innovate or we will die. And so Nadella helped them to recognize that while the numbers look good, the future didn't. And he said the future will no longer be in the goods that we provide today. The future is going to be in services. And over the course of 2014 to now, he's pivoted that company from primarily being a product company to being a services company. And in doing so, has unlocked tremendous value because he reimagined Microsoft. When he took over, they had slightly less than 400 billion in market cap. Today, many times it's approaching 3 trillion. That's in a decade. And that's not because of simply doing what we've always done. It was reimagining what we need to do and having the conviction to go do it. That's leadership. Companies need people they can scale human effort around. Companies need people who can not only imagine the future, but bring it to fruition. If you are a talented leader, you will always have a place because there aren't enough of them. And wherever they go, they create value. But leadership is not generic. So you can bring certain things from the military and apply them in other contexts, but you still have to have competence in that context. Competence and character. It's not enough simply to be, I'm inspirational. It's not enough simply to say, I'm physically fit. You have to know what you're talking about, and you have to know who you're talking with. You have to know what does it take to generate value here. And some of the things you learn in the military can absolutely map to other contexts, but you're going to have to become technically competent in that context. There's no getting around it.
All amazing points, sir. So not only kind of bringing those values over, kind of mapping what works in different organizations, and then also mapping kind of where you need to go as opposed to just being extremely efficient in what you do now. If I got that right, you give a lot of great things there, sir. I think along those lines, kind of pivoting back to your journey, can you explain for someone that wants to follow in your footsteps, how do I become, say, an associate dean of leadership or the director for the Doerr Center? Like, what does that process entail? Is that, more linear? Is that more happenstance? Is that more fortunate luck? Is that more just awesome reputation?
No, I think it's a combination of things. So I am what you would call a scholar practitioner. Having led organizations, I have amassed my own understanding of what it takes to build high performing teams. but I've also studied extensively. What do we know from science that can inform how we might go about those opportunities? And so I had the formal education that allowed me to be able to teach leadership, to teach the various models associated with it. And I had the practical experience of having led teams of different size and complexity all over the globe. And it was that combination that created my ability to learn how to put together effective programs, how to be able to work with companies across all sectors, and how to be able to drive something that was integrated in its approach. So that if given an opportunity like the one I had at Kellogg, or the opportunity here, or some of the opportunities I have in the private sector, I'm not one or the other. I'm not solely a there I was. I'm also, here's what I understand. It's the combination of the two that created a value proposition that allows me to do what I do today. Does that make sense?
It does, sir. So a combination of unique experiences, formal education that creates unique value proposition as opposed to pure academics and a pure practitioner.
Yeah, and it's not the organization's responsibility to figure out what value you can provide. It's your obligation to help organizations understand what value you can provide. And so my ability to translate the things I've done into needs they have has afforded me the opportunity to step into a variety of environments. One of the things I was always fond of doing in the military was always saying, now, if I had to explain what I was doing today to somebody who has no understanding of the military, could I do it effectively? That translation ability is absolutely critical. So you might not have an income statement in the military, but you most certainly have a budget. So do you learn how to communicate the things you do from a financial perspective in the military into terms that are understood by people in private sector organizations so that you understand the basics of a cash flow statement, income statement, balance sheet, that you have the ability to help them to understand how you've done sales, even if you never had a sales job. Now, you might have had a sales job if you were in recruiting command in the military, but I remember interviewing for a role, and it was a very senior executive role with a company that was owned by one of the major headhunting firms. And this company was responsible for working with senior leadership teams on culture change initiatives. A huge percentage of the role would be dedicated to sales, business development. And so some of the individuals interviewing me said, well, you've never sold anything. How do you know you can do it? And I kind of chuckled and I said, well, let me take you through the 7-step sales process and give you a recent example of how I had to enact it. One, they were surprised I knew the 7-step sales process. Two, when I walked them through how you conduct a shura in Iraq and how you have different competing interests and you're trying to sell various stakeholders on a desired outcome. And I walk them through prospecting, identifying, putting together a proposal, making the pitch, handling objections. I walked them through all that through the prism of a shura. And the last thing I said was, if I can walk into a tent and I'm trying to sell people not on killing one another and they come out of the tent, I'm pretty sure I'll be okay at any Ritz-Carlton doing a presentation for your organization. And they kind of laughed. And, they're like, yeah, I guess that makes sense. And so you might not view that activity from Iraq as necessarily being a sales engagement. But if you have that translative ability and you can help others to access that experience and see how it maps to something they're going to need from you, now you open up opportunities. But one, you've got to educate yourself to know frameworks like that because it's very easy to go, I'm in the military. I don't need to know the 7-step sales process. I'm in the military. I don't need to generally accept the accounting principles. I'm in the military. You could very easily explain all that away. But there will come a day where you will want somebody to put value on the time you've had in the military. And they're willing to do so, but only if they truly understand what have you done And what could that mean for me?
Converting relevant experience. That makes sense, sir. And also pulling in frameworks from where you're trying to go to make it applicable for your new stakeholders. You mentioned thinking about what value you bring. Can you talk about how you thought about bringing that value and how you thought about that transition process, especially as a general officer coming out of the military and really trying to convert that value proposition? Often we see people typically do board seats, you see a variety of exits. Can you
Mm-hmm.
talk about your journey and timeline and how that may look different? Say if you had exited at a different point.
One, I'm a big believer that we shouldn't try to leave the military behind. We should try to bring the military along with us wherever we go, but not have it be the only thing we rely on. Things like troop leading procedures work in other contexts. So use it. Things like after action reviews work in other contexts. So use it. Things like MDMP can work in another context. Use it so long as you demilitarize those times and say, now, how can I apply that same concept here? So I'm leading a team. How do I make sure that when we're about to get a new task, I issue a warning order? I start my initial planning prep. I'm doing my, you know, IPB, if you would, of what we might encounter along the way. I can use all those things, and I have used those things to great effect in other contexts. And so I embraced those things, but I also was open to the prospect of saying, now, what are the best practices over here that I need to learn, become really good at, and demonstrate that I can excel at the application of those practices? And I think a lot of folks, when coming out of the military, they don't think about what's next until the day they're signing their DD 214. They wait way too late to figure out, now, what am I going to do? And as a result, they get pigeonholed into things that have either been the most frequent transition opportunities, i.e., junior military officer recruiting jobs, or going into some three-letter agency in the government or whatever it is. And it's not to say any of those things are bad. They're great. They're wonderful. But what if you could have done more than that? But you restricted your ability to have a bigger opportunity set because you weren't thoughtful in terms of how you prepared for your transition. The time to think about it is not on the day you're transitioning. You got to start thinking about that well in advance, years in advance, so that you can then start building the set of developmental activities that allow you to make that transition well. And culturally in the Army, and I don't know if it's the same case in the other services, but in the Army in particular, we only want to promote Army until you're no longer in the Army. Even though we have things like ACAP and Soldier for Life and all the other stuff, we don't let people use that stuff until, 90 days out, 180 days out. I think one of the best things we've done in recent years are these, internships you can do for 4 to 6 months prior to transitioning out of the military. I think that's a phenomenal opportunity. But once again, you've got commanders that restrict how long they'll let somebody go do it. So even if the program says you could do it for X amount, they're like, nope, I'm not signing off on that, because we don't actually value helping people to transition well. We culturally view it like, oh, you're a quitter. You're not really, you're not down for the cause. And the thing is, the military is a volunteer force. If somebody serves for one day, serves for 30 years, we should say thank you for having raised your hand and committed to that service. And one of the ways in which we honor your having done that is by ensuring we help you to set yourself up for success wherever it is you're going next. But you have lots of chain of commands that do not do that well. And it's utterly disgusting in my mind. And so I made a decision long ago that while I love the military, I always knew no matter how successful, the military would come to an end. And I was determined to ensure that I transitioned the way I wanted to, not the way somebody else wanted me to. And so I just put thought into it.
So you put thought into it, you gave yourself some time. Any best practices in addition to giving yourself time and kind of feeling out where that best fit is, sir?
Start exploring what you could possibly do early. You don't know what you don't know, but there have been many people that you know that have gone before you. Reach out to them. Figure out what aspects do you enjoy in your job? What don't you like about your job? What would you have me understand about your job? How do you go about getting entry into, an industry, a function, whatever else? But just start reaching out broadly, ask thoughtful questions, and start to really refine what is it that I think I would really enjoy. I always encourage people to think about three circles. What are you good at? Right? You might be really good at math, right? So you're really good at, and then what are you passionate about? While I'm good at math, I'm not passionate about putting Excel spreadsheets together all day. So there might be a divergence between things I can do and things that I really enjoy doing. What is it I'm good at? And what is it I'm passionate about? And you can draw that third circle. Who's willing to pay me to work at the intersection of those two? Because if you're good at something, you're passionate about it, and you can derive economic benefit from doing it, then you're not working, you're thriving. But to know where that intersection exists, it requires you to engage in a lot of introspection. The more you know about self, the better you can position self. And a lot of folks do not think about those three. They might think about who's hiring military background folks, right? So they're thinking about who's willing to pay for that kind of thing. They might think about what skills do I bring? I was a logistician, right? So I displayed the ability to do that. But many times they don't necessarily think about what am I passionate about? They many times replace passion with who's willing to pay me the most. So I might get paid a significant amount of money. I might be able to do it, but I might not like it. I've seen countless people go to, premium brands like Amazon to be an operations manager or, insert name of a big company. They took a job and quickly they were like, I can do this, but I'm not digging this. And it's nothing against those companies. It's nothing against those roles. It's simply that person didn't put themselves in their best position because they lacked self-awareness.
It's one of my favorite frameworks, that good to great hedgehog concept. I love using that all the time. Kind of last couple of pieces, sir. So in the midst of this uncertainty, both for leaders and people considering a transition, what advice would you give people to think about the broader picture and then ways to kind of approach that uncertainty and kind of move through those fears?
Well, one is be curious. There is no excuse in today's age for lacking some awareness as it pertains to anything, because you can just go to the internet and you can research. So you can't just opt out and go, I don't know anything about marketing. I don't know anything about sales. I don't know anything about account. Well, those are opportunities out there. So start educating yourself on them. Don't wait for someone else to educate you on them. So read broadly. That's number one. Two, build relational networks. Harness all of the relationships you have. Family, friends, past co-workers, people who went to your undergraduate institution, people like whatever it is, cast a wide net and don't ask for people to give you something. Just ask for the gift of their time to build a genuine relationship with them and to learn from them. And if you do that well over time, when the right time comes, those people will want to help you because you've actually invested in building a genuine relationship with them. So be curious, build relationships. And then my last one is bet on self. Be willing to bet on self. If you're not willing to bet on self, then the vote is unanimous because who else is going to bet on you? And so, yes, others might tell you, oh man, don't do that. That's tricky or whatever else. But if you believe that's what I want to do and I'm going to do it, then bet on self. Have the conviction to go do the thing you say you want to do. Don't get talked out of it by somebody else who lacks the same conviction. Many times we act not based on our own insight, but based on the insight of others who really don't have your best interests in mind. They're simply giving you advice from their own perspective without really understanding who you are. And so if you say, you know what, I'm going to go do the thing that a lot of others say I shouldn't, but that's the thing that really excites me, then go for it. You can absorb the setback. Regret is the worst emotion in the human inventory. Never regret your unwillingness to bet on yourself. But if you're going to bet on yourself, I go back to those lessons in sport. Are you willing to put in the effort to prepare properly for whatever it is you're attempting to do? Are you willing to grind so you become really good at the basics of whatever it is you're attempting to do? And are you willing to work well in concert with others as a great teammate so that while you're pursuing your ambitions, you're also helping them to advance theirs?
So, in addition to that, kind of reading that natural curiosity, what are you currently reading, sir? Or podcasts you're listening to? Any recommendations, whether that's transitioning or things that have framed your leadership philosophy in this current environment?
Yeah, reading a lot on generative AI. I think it has fundamental implications across all occupations. For example, I've got a meeting coming up this week with a company that uses generative AI to enhance team effectiveness. And so learning about AI, spending a lot of time taking a look at macroeconomic environment. Obviously, when you look at the flashpoints that exist in the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, Europe, there's a lot going on, and we need to understand those forces because they impact a whole slew of things. And so we can't simply go through the world and be ignorant about what's going on in the world. And then I'm also, you know, just reading things broadly that on the surface have nothing to do with my job. I mean, I like music, I like to travel, I like to work out, I like to nap. Like there's all kinds of things. And so I think you have to also fuel those aspects as well. Don't make everything just about work. Make everything about how do you create a life where you flourish. When it comes down to recommendations, I'm always loath to say, oh, read this book. Or, like there's so many great books and resources out there. So I try to flip that and say, regardless of which one resource you pick a resource and actually dig into it. So if you're not reading a book, find one. If you're not listening to something cool, allocate time to doing that. If you're not going out and doing something cool, make the time, but do something.
Oh, amazing words, sir. You've given us a lot of great details, a lot of great insights. So pulling out the basics, kind of really understanding how you function as a part of a team. If people want to learn more about you, the things that you're working on, what's the best places for them to connect and follow the different initiatives that you're a part of, sir?
The easiest place to connect is via LinkedIn. Many times our institute is putting out a variety of messages via various social media platforms. Additionally, I get interviewed a lot for various media outlets. So you will see YouTube videos and other things that'll get posted routinely to the web. But LinkedIn is usually the easiest place to find out what's going on with me or what's going on with organizations that I'm privileged to be a part of.
And then is there anything that you have for our community, anything that you would like to either ask of our community, anything that you'd like to offer to our community?
Well, the ask of the community is truly be a resource to one another. People who know me know that I'm fond of words. And the study of words, the origin of them is something called etymology. And when we think about the word legacy, it comes from the Latin word legatus, which means person delegated. So what did the ancients mean by that? My perspective is that they understood our story would not be told by self. So that when somebody elects to tell your story, will the story they share be commensurate with the one you are intent on crafting? And if so, you will have forged a powerful legacy. Our legacy is rooted not in what we each say about one another, but it's what others elect to say about us. And so as a community, if we're truly committed to helping to foster one another's well-being, then that will foster a positive legacy. So that when someone reaches out to you and says, hey, I'd like to pick your brain on X, and you take the time to do that, that's crafting a powerful legacy. Hey, when somebody reaches out and they're struggling with something and you say, hey, let's work through this together. That's fostering a powerful legacy. And so we were all privileged to wear the cloth of our nation. We were privileged to form the bonds that will become part of our lives forever going forward. But those bonds shouldn't end when we take the uniform off. That commitment shouldn't wane simply because we're no longer on active duty. Always, always, always seek to try to help others. Now, there is the prospect of people always being takers and never giving. You can't just take. You have to give way more than you take. And so I would want every member of our community to give so that when it comes time to ask for something from the community, people are not only going to do it, but they're delighted to do it because you've been a great teammate.
All amazing wisdom, sir, and thank you again for sharing your journey. We appreciate your time so much. You've given a lot of great nuggets here.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.